The sky that morning seemed heavy, as if I sensed the approaching tragedy. The silence of the street was shattered by the dull crack of concrete giving way, and within seconds an entire building began to collapse before stunned eyes. Dust, screams, and deafening chaos filled the neighborhood as desperate mothers called for their children, and neighbors tried in vain to rush to help. But among them all there was one voice that cut the air with the most pain, that of a mother screaming the name of her child trapped under tons of rubble. And it was at that moment, amidst the suffocating dust and collective despair, that an unexpected figure appeared. A soldier on leave, simply crossing the street, carrying in his eyes the weight of war memories and the instinct to never turn his back on the pain of others. While the ground still shook from the impact of the fall, the soldier stopped before the pile of concrete crushing the sidewalk. People stared at him in disbelief, as if expecting him to back away, but the mother's screams pierced him like invisible bullets. He knelt, thrusting his hands between the stones and twisted iron, and with each breath, the dust burned his throat like embers. No one believed it would be possible to reach the child alive, but he believed, not just because of training, but because he already carried on his back the ghost of lives he couldn't save. Time became an enemy, every second a weight, and the question hanging in the air was whether that soldier could win the silent war against the destiny that already seemed written. If this story has already caught your attention, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the outcome. That morning, the United States awoke like any other ordinary day. The sun streamed through the wide windows of residential buildings, illuminating kitchens where mothers prepared breakfast. Children packed their backpacks for school, and workers hurried to catch up. It was a scene of normalcy, a silent symphony of routine that in a few hours would be violently interrupted. Among these ordinary people walked a man, carrying in his uniform folded over his shoulder a history of invisible battles. A soldier on leave who had returned to the city seeking peace among the familiar streets, but who still bore in his eyes the weight of memories that wouldn't let him rest. His step was firm, but his heart bore wounds that no medal could heal. He wasn't seeking to be a hero that day. He simply longed for a moment of tranquility, perhaps a cup of coffee, a gaze lost in the distance, a memory of life before the war. Across the street, in an old light-colored brick building, a mother combed her young daughter's hair while begging her older boy not to be late. Her cries weren't of pain, yet just the rush of everyday life. Her voice echoed through the narrow hallways, full of love and impatience, as ordinary as any other morning. The girl clutched a colorful notebook, while her older brother ran from room to room trying to find his shoes. The house breathed life, innocence, and the illusory calm of those who believe the world will remain the same forever. The soldier was crossing the sidewalk when a strange sound rent the air. First, a low, almost imperceptible crack, as if something deep within the earth had groaned. Then a louder one, echoing like dry thunder. He paused for a moment, frowning, feeling in his chest that instinct only those who have survived combat know, that something was about to happen. Passers-by looked around in confusion. Some even laughed nervously, believing it was just the rumble of a truck in the distance. But then the inevitable happened. The building before him shook as if struck by an invisible blow. Windows shattered, curtains flew through the air, and within seconds the structure began to split. The sound was deafening, like an avalanche of concrete swallowing the ground. People ran in panic, cars screeched to a halt, and dust filled the street like a suffocating cloud. The soldier took a step back, instinctively raising his arm to his face to protect himself, but his eyes didn't waver. Inside, amid the sound of twisting iron and desperate screams, echoed the call he could never ignore. It was at that moment that a mother's scream cut through the air like a blade. My son is still in there." The desperation in her voice reverberated louder than the crumbling walls. The woman threw herself forward, trying to break through the dust, but was held back by panicked neighbors who were pulling her back. Her dilated eyes, wet with tears, reflected the cruel certainty that her boy was trapped under tons of rubble. The little girl clutched her hand, also sobbing, but the mother could only scream for her lost son. The soldier took a deep breath. Inside him, something ignited like a forgotten ember. The memory of faces he couldn't save in distant lands, the weight of broken promises on the battlefield, the pain of carrying ghosts that never left him. He knew that there, before him, destiny was calling him again. As the crowd watched in shock, motionless, he clenched his fists and took the first step toward the chaos. And so, just as everyone retreated, the soldier advanced. The crash echoed as if the earth itself had decided to split in two. The building that had once seemed solid, albeit ancient, turned to dust before the astonished eyes of everyone passing by. Glass exploded outward, sending shards flying like shimmering blades in the sunlight. Wooden doors flew like paper, and the concrete gave way in waves, collapsing with relentless fury. Dust rose in seconds, swallowing the vision of those trying to comprehend what was happening, transforming the bright day into a scene of suffocating darkness. People screamed, some ran in despair, others stood paralyzed with shock, unsure whether to look, help, or simply pray in silence. Cars parked next to the building were struck by chunks of concrete. Alarms blared in unison, creating a chaotic soundtrack that mingled with cries for help. A woman fell to her knees on the sidewalk, covering her head with her hands, while a father pulled his two children away, dragging them with the urgency of someone who feels death is close behind. The dust invaded their lungs, burned their throats, and made their eyes water uncontrollably. It was impossible to breathe, impossible to think, impossible to believe that in just a few seconds the lives of so many families had been turned into ruins. Amidst the tumult, the mother screaming for her son stood out like a desperate flame. Her eyes searched frantically among the dust and rubble, and with each passing second her voice grew more piercing, a call no one dared answer. She struggled against the arms that tried to hold her, begging, crying, trying to run toward the building that still creaked like a wounded animal about to collapse. Her small daughter clung to her skirt, sobbing incomprehensibly, but aware of the fear etched on her mother's face. The soldier, standing before that scene, felt his heart race with the same intensity as when he heard bombs falling in war zones. The sound of the structure collapsing was so familiar that for an instant he found himself back on the front line, surrounded by ruins and screams, and once again faced with the same choice: retreat and survive, or advance and forever carry the burden of not having tried. The difference was that this time he was not just a combatant, but an anonymous man before civilians who looked to him as if seeking a miracle. More pieces of the building fell, kicking up waves of dust that hid any sign of life. Yet with each break between the crashes, a muffled sound seemed to be heard coming from within, a child's cry, faint, almost drowned out by the surrounding noise. The mother swore she heard it, pointing to the wreckage, and each time she screamed her son's name, her voice pierced the soldier's heart like a silent command. He knew there was no time, that the chances were slim, but he also knew that fate had placed him there on that street at that time. As the crowd retreated, fearing further collapse, he stepped forward. His body was already beginning to feel the sting of the dust burning his lungs, but his mind was focused on a single objective: finding the child. His eyes scanned the chaos as if it were a battlefield, calculating entry points, assessing every piece of concrete, every iron bar, as if searching for a route through the destruction. A tense silence fell for a few seconds, broken only by the groaning of twisted iron. In that brief pause, the soldier knelt, placing his hand on the still-warm debris of dust, and closed his eyes. Deep down, it wasn't just technique or courage. It was faith, a silent faith, born of the pain of someone who had already lost too much and couldn't allow himself to fail again. When he opened his eyes, he already knew. There was no going back. His mother, seeing him approach, clutched his arm desperately, her teary eyes pleading wordlessly. He simply nodded as if to say he would take the burden upon himself. And then he dove into the rubble, disappearing in the cloud of dust as the entire street held its breath, torn between hope and fear that it was too late. He breathed in the dust as if breathing in the past. The metallic taste in his mouth brought back memories that had never faded. Moonless nights in devastated villages, walls cracked by artillery shells, the cries of a child who found no escape, and the gaze of a mother who never left him alone. There, before the still groaning rubble, the soldier felt the same cold in his hands, the same weight between his ribs, the same question that preceded every difficult decision. What if I fail again? Instead of retreating, He grabbed that question like a rope and pulled back to himself the only certainty that had kept him alive for so long. Someone has to go. And today, that someone is me. The world around him seemed to reduce to pulses, as if time had become a heart. 1, 2, 3, the crack of iron, 4, 5, 6. His mother's scream, 7, 8, 9. His own blood pounding in his ear, reminding him that the body has limits and fear tries to impose its own. He pushed the fear deep into his chest and let his training take over. His gaze sought angles, red shadows, calculated lines of weight and muffled sounds. He had learned far away that ruins speak, ruins warn. If the noise changes, the threat changes. If the dust falls like a fine rain, there is a new vibration. If the air escapes in short bursts, there is a breach. And that morning, the ruins spoke in a harsh whisper that called for haste. At the edge of the sidewalk, someone was trying to film with their cell phone, but he raised his hand, firm, without shouting, and the gesture was worth an order. The soldier's eyes had the authority of someone who had seen everything crumble, and yet he stayed. He asked for water, not to drink, but to moisten a piece of cloth he'd improvised as a mask, because he knew dust kills quickly and confuses the mind. He dropped to one knee, feeling the vibration of the concrete like a living animal, and closed his eyes for a second. He didn't pray with words, but made a vow. If there's a breath of life in there, I'll find it. The vow was accepted in silence, because almost simultaneously, a tiny, almost unreal sound seemed to penetrate the dust, like someone knocking 3 times softly on a door. He leaned forward, pressed his ear to a broken block of cement, and listened to his own heart racing against the world. He thought of the friend he couldn't pull out from under a slab in a foreign city, thought of the letter he'd written to that friend's mother and never sent, thought of the promises he'd sworn never to repeat. There was no audience that mattered, no medal that could change what was to come. There was only a child weighed down by too much weight, and a mother with her life hanging in her throat. Every fiber of his being responded to the ancient call to go where no one wants to go and return with someone everyone already considers lost. The dust stung like salt in the wounds he barely realized he'd opened. Instinctively, he assessed the instability of what remained standing, sought the points that might give way again, identified a narrow path, a triangle of life where air still circulated, perhaps by a small miracle that maintained a gap between 2 broken beams. He knew that entering without thinking is as deadly as not entering at all, so he mentally mapped out 3 steps. Approach without causing displacement, listen again, test the first lever. The rest would come through the improvisation that experience teaches us to call discipline. And when he stood up, his hands covered in dust and his eyes burning, he felt that the past had finally opened the door to the chance to repair what cannot be repaired, not to change yesterday, but to prevent today from becoming another ghost. He turned his face to his mother, who was trembling as if she were an internal ruin, and nodded just once, a small gesture that promised everything. He asked them to step back 2 steps, asked for silence for 10 seconds, asked that no one touch the pile when he began, and then, in the same thin voice with which he had once commanded men at their limit, he said to himself and to the world, "I'm going in." The street air seemed to hold its breath along with him. The city, which moments before had been nothing but routine, transformed into the intimate theater of an ancient battle. One fought with hands, with lungs, and with that which keeps a man standing when nothing else sustains him, the sense of being alive for more than survival. The first contact with the rubble was like touching a living, pulsating body that threatened to collapse at any moment. The soldier placed his hand on a broken beam, feeling the vibration of instability running through it. The sound of the creaking metal was like a groan, a warning that time was not on his side. He took a deep breath through the damp cloth pressed to his face, drawing it in short bursts, and advanced a little further, crawling between cracked blocks and sharp debris that could tear his skin with one wrong move. Each step was measured, each touch of the ground a risky gamble between moving forward or causing a greater fall. With calloused hands, he began to remove smaller chunks of concrete, carefully setting them aside, trying to clear a path that was narrow but manageable. The twisted iron grew like claws, holding him back, and more than once he had to push forward, scraping his arms until he opened deep cuts. Blood flowed, but he didn't look, feeling nothing but the urgency of the call coming from within the rubble. With each movement, the muffled sound seemed to take shape, almost as if a faint breath were trying to reach the surface. Behind him, the crowd watched in silence. People didn't dare get too close, fearing that any wrong step would cause a complete collapse. The mother, kneeling on the sidewalk, wept uncontrollably, repeating her son's name like an incessant prayer. Her body rocked back and forth, as if trying to keep the invisible connection with the child alive, believing her voice could penetrate the concrete and give him the strength to endure. The soldier remembered his training, not to shift the wrong weight, not to strain structures that support the whole, calculating every gesture as if it were a chess game with death itself. Even so, the dust blinded, the heat stifled, and the sound of the pieces still crumbling around him created a constant atmosphere of terror. He used not only strength, but also the intuition that experience had given him, a sixth sense honed in fields where every second decided who returned home and who remained buried in silence. A beam blocked his progress, wedged between two broken walls that leaned dangerously. He tried to lift it with his arms, but the weight was unbearable. He felt his muscles burn, his shoulders scream with pain, and for a moment he considered giving up on that route. But then, a memory of a distant night flashed through him. A comrade trapped under the rubble of a bombing raid, asking only not to be left alone. The plea echoed in the present, and the soldier found within himself a strength that came not just from his muscles, but from his refusal to abandon another life in the shadow of death. With superhuman effort, he managed to shift the beam a few centimeters, enough to create a narrow passage. The muffled sound seemed clearer now. Maybe it was a frail cry, maybe just his mind trying to fill the silence, but it didn't matter. It was reason to keep going. Sweat ran down his face, mixed with the dust, turning his skin to mud. His breathing was heavy, growing shallower, but his arms didn't stop. His hands wouldn't rest. He pulled blocks, pushed pieces, dragged himself through the gaps as if he were part of the ruin itself. Outside, people began to murmur, some praying aloud, others simply closing their eyes, unable to bear the sight. The mother, however, did not look away. Her eyes, red with tears, were fixed on the shadow of the soldier, disappearing deeper and deeper into the heart of the rubble. She knew this man was fighting not just the concrete, but something invisible, a personal battle no one else understood. With each meter gained, the pressure increased. A louder crack shook the ground, as if a section of the ground were about to give way, sending tons of rocks crashing down upon him. The soldier froze for a second, feeling his heart pounding in his ears, but he didn't retreat. The decision had been made. If the rubble fell, let it find him advancing, not fleeing. He adjusted his breathing, tensed his arms, and continued even deeper, because he knew that there, amidst the dust and fear, was a life waiting to be saved. She was kneeling on the sidewalk, her entire body seized by an uncontrollable tremor, as if every fiber of her soul had been shattered along with the building. Her eyes burned, red from the dust and the unceasing tears, and her throat burned from screaming her son's name, always the same call repeated like a desperate prayer. At times her voice rose loudly, almost furiously, as if she wanted to challenge the rubble to return her child. At others, her voice dissolved into weak sobs, as if she no longer had the strength to breathe. Between the dust suspended in the air and the uncomfortable silence of the crowd, the mother seemed to be fighting alone the cruelest battle anyone could face, whether to believe her son still breathed, or to surrender to the weight of the loss that already threatened to suffocate her. Memories came in waves, overwhelming the present with images that hurt her even more. She saw the boy running around the room that very morning, begging to take his favorite toy in his backpack. She remembered his loud laughter, his clumsy way of tying his shoelaces, the way he always said, "I'm coming, Mom," when she called him for the third time. Each memory came back with such clarity that it made her heart break, as if she no longer had the strength to distinguish between life and an early goodbye. She clutched her little daughter's arm as she cried uncomprehendingly and repeated like a mantra, "He'll get out. He'll get out of there." It was more for herself than for others, because deep down she knew that hope was fragile as the pieces of concrete that still threatened to fall. Each time she heard a crack from within the rubble, her body would contract in spasms. Fear would overwhelm her, and for a moment her faith would vanish like dust in the wind. But then she remembered the boy's eyes, the pure innocence that had never known the weight of the world, and that memory would rekindle a flame. Time seemed to stand still. Seconds stretched into hours, each scream echoed like an eternity, and the sight of the soldier disappearing deeper and deeper into the dust filled her with an unbearable mix of fear and trust. Who was that man? Why was he, of all people, risking his own life to save a child who wasn't his? She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she clung to that stained uniform and that firm posture as if it were the last anchor to keep her from going mad. At one point, someone nearby tried to hold her back, telling her to step back, not to come too close. She responded with a scream that wasn't just of rage, but of maternal, almost animal instinct. No one would tear her away from the invisible line that connected her to her son. If he was still breathing beneath those rocks, she needed to be there, screaming his name, so he would know his mother had never abandoned him. The world could fall apart, but her voice would penetrate any barrier. Memories mingled cruelly with the present. She remembered the night the boy had a high fever and stayed in her lap until he fell asleep, the first time he entered school, the way he always said he wanted to be strong to protect her. Now she was the one who wanted to protect him, but she was powerless, standing outside while another man risked everything for him. This helplessness destroyed her. Her chest felt squeezed by an invisible hand, and with each breath she felt like she might faint. But she didn't. Something greater kept her going, something beyond physical strength, something only a mother can explain. The need to fight for a child, even when nothing else can be done. Suddenly, amidst the chaos, she thought she heard a muffled sound. A sob, a small moan coming from within the wreckage. Her eyes widened, and she screamed even louder, calling the boy's name, crying as if her heart had found a spark of hope. Some around her said that perhaps it was just an illusion, that there was nothing there. But for her it didn't matter. That sound was real as her faith that her son was still there. At every moment the mother lived between two worlds, that of grief that threatened to crush her, and that of hope that stubbornly survived. And between these two extremes, her soul was torn apart, sustained only by the courage to keep screaming, as if her voice were the invisible bridge capable of keeping her son clinging to life. His body began to take its toll the second meter. He advanced beneath the labyrinth of stone and iron, a tear in his left forearm that burned like fire, the skin on his shoulder scraped by the rough contact with the concrete, his knees throbbing with each push as the dust filled his lungs and transformed breathing into a raw, heavy, noisy effort. The damp cloth on his face no longer overcame the dryness of the air. Each breath was a scratch from within, and he felt his chest shorten as if a metal ring were slowly closing around his ribs. Still, he pressed on, using his elbows as levers, pushing smaller blocks with the heels of his hands, trying not to tremble when a steel bar grazed his makeshift helmet and sang that sharp sound that always precedes danger. The small stones dug under his nails, and when he forced a plate aside, the edge cut his palm with the cold precision of a blade. Blood trickled discreetly, warm, mixed with the dust, and for an instant the world spun. He closed his eyes, fighting the dizziness, bit his lip to ground his mind, and counted slowly to 3 as he had learned to do when pain wanted to command more than the mission. There was an invisible beat within the rubble, a rhythm formed by the creak of metal, the low groan of the structure, the whisper of falling dust. He entered this beat as if dancing with an enemy, calculating the weight of the next step, waiting for the right pause, reading the blind will of the ruin. His body screamed for water, for air, for rest, but the child's voice, real or remembered, came like a thread of sound, crossing the labyrinth and connecting him to what mattered. One more, he thought. One more block, one more beam, one more meter. And with each one more, he dragged himself along, tingling from his fingers to his shoulders, feeling his shirt stick to his back, his sweat turning to mud, his throat burning as if embers were hidden deep in his chest. A strange vibration ran through the floor, and he froze, throwing his entire body against the cement, to feel with his chest what his eyes could not foresee. The tremor passed like a short, treacherous wave, and he knew that above him a piece had shifted, perhaps by millimeters, enough to turn the narrow passage into a trap. His mind twitched with an image of collapse, and instinct ordered retreat, but the memory of his mother's scream nipped the hesitation in the bud. He didn't speak loudly, but his own voice rang firm inside his head. "I'm only coming back from here with this child in my arms." With surgical care, he braced the weight of a slab on an improbable triangle of brick and iron, tested its resistance with his shoulder, braced his body to absorb any impact that might come, and shifted the critical slab a hand's breadth, opening a window of shade where the air seemed to circulate. Blindly, he reached through the window and felt for a void. Then another edge, another rough coldness, no skin, no childish fabric, just a broken toy his hand recognized by its outline, a plastic wheel, half a car. His heart beat a new rhythm, his teeth clenched, and a strange heat, not of fever but of resolve, rose from his stomach to his face. He tucked the wheel into his pocket like someone binding a vow, and advanced another full length, feeling a dry crack in his lower back and ignoring the twinge. The cough came violently, tearing at the tears, and for a second the world blurred. He pressed his forehead against the cold concrete, accepted the dizziness without conceding defeat, breathed in shallow gasps, reopened his focus. The structure creaked again, demanding respect, and he responded with patience and cunning. He pushed a small stone to wedge a crack, twisted a rebar to create space for his shoulders, glided like a swimmer in heavy water. Then the sound returned, a faint, intermittent tap, as if tiny fingers were tapping on plastic. The soldier held his breath, turned his head to the right, put his ear to the gap, and heard, amidst the harsh orchestra of the ruin, something no training teaches one to believe, a short, irregular breath, insisting on existing. The pain in his hands, the burning in his lungs, the dust fever that burned inside, everything rearranged itself in the background, like furniture pushed to make way for someone who needs to pass. He dropped deeper, supported his weight on the inside of his arm to free his left, searched for the right spot, found a thin beam supporting two larger plates, and calculated that if he removed it with a slow rotation, gravity would do the rest without crushing the void of air where that breath lived. He counted again, 1, 2, 3, and turned, feeling the old wood crack like bone. The space opened a little, and dust came cascading down. He closed his mouth and resisted the urge to cough. He reached through the crack and finally touched something that wasn't stone or steel. It was fabric. Warm fabric. And beneath the fabric, a tiny vibration, a racing heart, an entire universe crying out for help, with beats the size of a sparrow. He whispered that he was there, that he wouldn't leave without taking that life with him, and his own body seemed to accept the order. Pain, wait a little, fear, stay still, exhaustion, endure one more. Because now the path had a destination, and destination always weighs less than the rubble. The touch of that living fabric beneath the dust was like a shot through time. For an instant, the soldier was no longer beneath the collapsed building on an American street. He was back in a distant village in the dead of night, with the sky tinted red by explosions and the air thick with smoke. The voices of the present mingled with the screams of the past, and the weight on his shoulders was the same that had crushed him that night, years before, when his best friend was trapped under a broken slab. He remembered the scene in painful detail, his comrade's gaze pleading for help, the blood streaming down the side of his face, his outstretched hand begging for seconds more of life. She also remembered the muffled sound of the ceiling collapsing behind him and the shouted order to retreat, the order he obeyed with a broken heart, leaving behind not just a soldier, but a brother in arms. Since then, that memory had become an open wound that never healed, and every time she closed her eyes in silence, she saw the same face, the same plea, the same sense of helplessness. Now before the child everything repeated itself, but with one difference that changed everything. This time he would not obey fate. It didn't matter if the building still creaked with the threat of collapse. It didn't matter if his body was already screaming for surrender. He would not return home with another ghost on his shoulders. The sweat that ran down his forehead wasn't just exertion, it was also the purification of years of accumulated guilt. He felt in the burning heat of every muscle the rare chance of redemption that fate had granted him. the chance to right a wrong he could never accept. The image of his friend had haunted him like a shadow, but now it had transformed into strength. He heard his voice mixed with the echo of his mother screaming outside, "Don't leave me here." The two voices, fused in his heart, became an oath. The soldier tightened his fingers against the fragile hand he'd found beneath the child's cloth, and in that small contact, he made a silent promise. "I won't let go. If the rubble falls, we'll fall together. But this time, there will be no abandonment." Each removed stone felt like a fragment of the very war he still carried within. His hands, covered in blood and dust, reminded him of the nights he'd improvised excavations in foreign ruins, searching for signs of life that never came. Now the difference was palpable. The child's breath was there, weak but stubborn, and with each frail beat of that heart, he felt the weight of years of pain turn to fuel. The surroundings helped the memory. The tense silence of the street was like the silence after an attack, when everyone waited for the next explosion. The mother's eyes were like the eyes of so many others he had seen, eyes that lost everything and didn't even have the strength to cry. He knew he couldn't let this woman experience the same grief so many had experienced far away. She wouldn't just be a child saved, she would be a broken link between past and present, a chance to give back to the world something that had been ripped from her. At one point, a gust of dust swallowed his vision, and he had to close his eyes to keep from suffocating. In that involuntary darkness, the image of his friend appeared once more, but not with pain. It appeared as a guide, as if telling him that this was the time to make amends. When he opened his eyes, the soldier felt he was no longer alone. Within him was the strength of all those left behind, of all those who were not rescued, of all those who waited for a hand that never came. This strength pushed him deeper, forcing his body to ignore the pain, the hunger for air, the fever that was already beginning to burn beneath his skin. He knew that if he could get that child out alive, the weight of guilt wouldn't disappear completely, but it would take on new meaning. It would be like transforming a scar into a shield, pain into purpose. Deep down, he understood that he wasn't just saving a child. He was saving himself from remaining a prisoner of a night that never ended. And in that silent oath, sworn among stones, iron, and dust, the soldier sealed a choice in destiny. History would not repeat itself. The advance was a constant negotiation with death. Each stone removed seemed to release a bit of air and at the same time threatened to bring down the entire structure. The soldier felt the weight of the living building upon him, like a sleeping giant about to crush him if he dared breathe too loudly. The silence was treacherous. When there were no cracks, the fear was even greater, because it meant the ruin was waiting for the exact moment to give way. The iron creaked like the taut strings of a macabre instrument, vibrating with each stroke, reminding him that even the slightest mistake could turn rescue into burial. His hands, already wounded, worked like claws, digging, pulling, testing for purchase. He learned to listen to the language of concrete. If the sound was high-pitched, there was tension. If it was low-pitched, there was displacement. If it was accompanied by falling dust, it was a warning of collapse. At each sign, he stopped, breathed, observed. Seconds stretched out like eternities. And while the crowd waited outside, restrained by fear, he was the only one moving inside, the only one carrying on his shoulders the responsibility of fighting against the sentence that ruin had already written. A larger block appeared ahead, blocking the narrow passage he had opened. The soldier tried to push against it with his back, but the weight was too much. Sweat ran down his face, stinging his eyes like salt. He backed up a few inches, braced his back against a broken beam and used his legs as leverage. The effort was brutal, every muscle burning with agony, his breath already a short growl. But finally the block shifted a few inches, revealing a gap. The sound that followed, however, chilled his spine. A loud crack followed by a long vibration that rippled through the entire floor. It was as if the building had woken up and announced, "You've messed with something you shouldn't have." Instinct screamed to retreat, but the memory of the small whimper he'd heard held him steady. He pressed himself against the ground, pressing his ear against the dust, listening for any sign. And there it was again. Faint, ragged, but alive. The child's breathing. It was more powerful than any threat. He gathered his strength, steadied the side blocks with smaller pieces of concrete, and continued. Every movement was now accompanied by a sharp suspense, as if the air itself waited to see if he would be crushed. Outside, his mother screamed louder and louder, but her voice reached him like a distant echo, mixed with the clang of iron and the rapid beating of his own heart. It was a chaotic soundtrack that became fuel. The soldier advanced like an animal trapped in narrow burrows, his body scratched, his clothes in tatters, his skin covered in blood and dust. Yet his determination was so palpable, it seemed to create light in the darkness. Suddenly a shower of dust fell on his head. He froze. A block above him had slid half a foot away, supported only by a rebar that trembled like a thread about to snap. If it gave way, there would be no time to escape. He closed his eyes, held his breath, and waited. The rebar groaned, stretched a little more, but held. The soldier exhaled slowly, with the calm of someone who knows that every second gained is a gift. He advanced another meter, ever closer to the sound coming from below. He was exhausted, but there was something inside him, a flame that no amount of pain could extinguish. With each stone removed, he felt himself moving closer, not only to the child, but also to his own redemption. The past seemed to push him forward, and the future, trapped there, cried out for release. And so, even faced with the constant threat of everything collapsing at once, he pressed on, knowing that in that moment there was no choice. Either he would overcome the rubble, or ruin would overcome them all. The first thing that broke the silence was a sound too small for such a large world. 3 timid, irregular taps, as if tiny fingers were searching for a door. The soldier held his breath, put his ear to the crack and whispered, more to guide than to soothe, that this was the way, to keep knocking like this. The response came faintly, but it came. 3 taps, a pause, 2 short taps, and he felt his skin crawl all over, because it was survival language, a code no school teaches. He reached his arm through the gap, feeling through dust and splinters, until he touched the warm fabric again. Under his hand, the small body vibrated with a quick tremor, and he knew the child was conscious enough to obey. He moved 2 side blocks with watchmaker's care, and in the stirring of the dust, something hard brushed his fingers. The carcass of a cart, blue, one of its wheels missing. I knew immediately what it meant. He took the little wheel he had already put away from his pocket, half a vote, and mentally fitted the pair together, as if minds could assemble toys in the dark. Before the passage closed again, he pulled the toy car toward him and turned it in his fingers, feeling the scratched plastic, the faded stickers, a tiny label with the number 7 stuck crookedly. It was the kind of thing a mother recognizes from a distance. He turned his face toward the dim streetlight and shouted, without wasting a breath, that he needed a discreet hand at the edge of the crack. A neighbor lay down in the dust, stretched out his arm, received the toy, and in a rapid cycle of clapping and trembling arms, the toy reached his mother. She held it like someone taking back a piece of her own heart. At first she didn't understand. Then she saw the absence of the wheel, and the cry that came from her wasn't of pain. It certainly was. It was the toy the boy had insisted on carrying in his backpack that morning. It was the toy she'd asked him not to forget. Hope, which until then had been just a spark fighting for air with the dust, ignited fully within her. The murmur of the street changed tone, as if the wind had shifted. Someone began repeating, "He's alive," and someone else corrected, "He might still be." But for the mother, the word might no longer existed. She clutched the stroller to her chest, and her voice cracking called for silence. The crowd obeyed instinctively. In the rare pause between pops came the sound everyone needed to hear. A suppressed cry, a hurried gasp, a mum that didn't arrive whole, but arrived. The woman's knees gave way, and yet she didn't fall. She was lifted by hands I didn't recognize, supported by bodies that also trembled. The entire street for an instant became an extension of her heart. Inside, the soldier took advantage of the favorable tide that only hope can create. He spoke softly, slowly, and asked the child to tap again. He received 2, the third failed, and that was enough to better locate the point of life. To the left, between 2 plates that formed a crooked triangle of air, there was a space where light insinuated itself like golden dust. If he could widen that triangle, Oxygen would reach the child better, and the small lungs would stop struggling in the dark. He tested a supporting rod, slipped a small stone under the larger edge, and pushed with the side of his shoulder until a crack announced that, by millimeters, there was more room. The response from within was immediate. His breathing gained rhythm, still shallow but less desperate. Sirens began to swell in the distance, piercing the air with the urgency America knows by heart. Firefighters and paramedics surged like a red and white tide, organizing perimeters, ordering people to stay away, distributing masks and orders. A captain crouched on the edge, tried to see the man buried in the heart of the ruin, and asked in a firm voice what he needed. The soldier didn't waste the opportunity. He asked for thin flashlights, a small car jack, and demanded total silence when he said, "Stop." Cooperation was immediate. Trained arms passed tools through a human line that trembled not with fear, but with readiness. Outside, the mother spoke to her son as if she could reach him through the soldier's body. She quietly recounted a simple memory, the first time he'd ridden that cart, and laughed between sobs, a sound that confused tears with tenderness. She knew he couldn't hear her properly, but she also knew that love finds paths where no voice can. Each word she spoke seemed to lift a layer of heaviness from the air. The soldier, hearing this voice, felt his chest widen slightly, as if he were breathing for two. More dust fell as he adjusted the jack under a concrete ledge. The metal bit into the stone with a squeak, and the sign lifted enough for the light from the thin flashlights to shine through, cutting through the darkness like a needle. It was then he saw it. A dirty grey sweatshirt sleeve, trembling almost imperceptibly, and inside it a small clenched fist. He reached out, offered 2 fingers. The fist, in the pure reflection of life, grasped. The tiny gesture passed through the soldier's body like a renewed oath, and outside crossed the street like a formless flash. The fire captain raised his hand for more silence, but his eyes were already smiling. "He's with me," the soldier said, without raising his voice. There was no need to repeat. The mother pressed her forehead against the blue stroller and cried differently, with warm tears that wash but don't drown. She didn't know how, didn't know when, didn't know what the building would still demand in return, but in that second she knew her son somehow was coming back. And that certainty, fragile as a toy wheel and yet strong as steel, rekindled everything. The street, the arms of strangers, the firefighter's protocol, the breath of the man breaking and remaking himself inside. Hope finally had an object, a sound, a touch. And anyone who has stood on the brink of the abyss knows that this is like opening a door. The moment the small fingers clasped his was like a miracle of life, hidden beneath tons of stone. But the victory was brief. The building reacted to the boldness like a wounded animal shaking to expel anyone who dares touch it. A dull rumble echoed through the ground, heavier than the previous ones, making everything vibrate as if the entire street were breathing heavily. Dust fell in denser cascades, and a beam to the left creaked with a long metallic sound, warning that it was about to give way. The soldier froze for a second, eyes closed, his trained mind weighing all the options. If he retreated a few meters, he could save himself and wait for the heavy equipment that was already being brought in, but in that time the child would lose what oxygen he had left. If he advanced, he could cause the collapse and bury them both. The silence that followed the vibration was the cruelest of all, because it carried the question no one dared answer. What is worth more, the life of one or the life of two? The mother, outside, was unaware of the cold mathematics being worked out inside. She saw only dust and darkness, heard only the echo of the firefighters' dry orders and the incessant crack of stones. But the soldier knew. He had made such calculations in other lands, when he had to choose between obeying a strategic retreat or carrying in his arms someone crying for help. Every time he had retreated, guilt had followed him like a shadow. Now, the same dilemma repeated itself, but with the difference that there was no command above him, no hierarchy that could justify his departure. There, it was just him and the weight of his own heart. The tremor repeated, stronger, and a larger chunk of the upper slab slipped, hitting an iron bar that nearly broke. The noise echoed like thunder, and thick dust filled his mouth and nose, making him cough silently to maintain control. The arm holding the child trembled, But the small fist didn't let go. It was as if that fragile gesture told him without words that there was no option but to move forward. He remembered his friend lost on the battlefield, and how many times he'd thought, if I had stayed one more minute, if I had risked one more step, maybe. Maybe had always been the sentence that kept him awake at night. Now, faced with another life, he wouldn't let maybe overcome him. Breathless, chest burning and muscles exhausted, he made the decision he knew would change everything. He would not retreat. He lowered himself as far as possible, using his back to support some of the weight of a beam, and quickly gestured to the firefighters on the ledge for absolute silence. Within the darkness, every sound seemed magnified. He used the small car jack to raise the slab another foot, while dust fell in thick rain onto his shoulders. His right arm throbbed with intense pain. The cut on his forearm burned like a hot iron. But still, with slow, calculated movements, he managed to create enough space to pull the child closer. The small body was dirty, covered in dust, its breathing irregular, but alive. A new crack came, this time prolonged, as if the ceiling had decided to collapse completely. The soldier's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, dragging the child against his chest, protecting her with his torso as a shield. It was risking everything in seconds that felt like eternities. The stones slid, some slammed into his back, and for a moment he felt darkness threaten to swallow him whole. But the space he had opened held. The rebar creaked, bent like bows about to snap, but they held. Outside, the silence was broken by another cry from the mother, which turned into a prayer. And the crowd joined in as if their collective faith could hold the building together. Each word was an invisible rope holding the soldier inside. He closed his eyes for a second, feeling not only his own strength but the strength of everyone waiting outside. In the midst of the chaos, holding the child close, he realized something profound. He wasn't just saving a life, he was deciding who he would be from then on. If he survived, he would no longer carry the mark of abandonment, but the mark of choice. And even though the entire building might have fallen on them, in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt free. His body began to fail him in a way he knew from other wars. First came the fine spasms in his hands, then the constant burning in his lower back, then the ringing in his ears that seemed to transform all sounds into sea. His vision blurred for a moment, and when the dust settled a little, he realized he was hugging the child with only one arm, while the other tried to hold open the gap that separated them from the small triangle of air. "Stay with me," he whispered, not as an order but as a pact. The tiny fist responded by squeezing two of his fingers, and that touch rekindled a strength that no longer came from the muscle. It came from a nameless place, where guilt and promise meet and become decision. He assessed the supports with his touch, as if reading danger in braille. A large sign held up by two smaller ones, a rebar drawing a tense arc over his head, an old slat preventing everything from descending at once. Any sudden movement would be doom, so instead of brute force he chose fierce patience. He slid the jack a few inches, wedged one side with what remained of a doorpost, secured the other with two smaller stones, and only then turned the crank in a half-moon pattern, millimeter by millimeter, until he heard a short click that wasn't a threat, but an agreement. The passage opened a finger. Was that enough? For someone with nothing, a finger was the beginning of the world. He pulled the child closer, first freeing the trapped sleeve, then the hair, and realized that the little one's knee was trapped under a shard of concrete that cut like a knife. Time outside became prayer. Inside, it became counting. Inhale, count 3, exhale halfway to preserve lung capacity, he repeated. With his free hand, he fished for the simple belt he wore in his pocket and tied it around the boy's ankle, not to pull violently, but to have a point of traction that maintained the correct angle. "When I say now, we'll get there together," he murmured, knowing the child would understand more from his tone than his words. Outside, the light of a thin flashlight caught his eyes, and he responded with a calculated blink. A fireman understood. The light moved to mark the jack screw. Another beam illuminated the ledge he needed to climb, and the soldier knew he was no longer alone in this detail. A long patch of dust fell like a curtain. He held back the cough in the back of his throat. accepting the pain as the price. The hand holding the crack open began to tremble. The fear of losing everything in a single mistake rose like a fever. That was when his mother's voice pierced the ruin with the simplicity only love can achieve. She was softly singing a silly melody from childhood, the same one that lulls fevers and banishes nightmares. The music entered through a crack the dust couldn't close. The boy responded with a brave sob, and the soldier felt the rhythm of his own heart adjust to the rhythm of that song, as if breathing on borrowed air. "Now," he said. He turned the crank. The jack groaned. The plate lifted slightly. The rebar hissed, the slat creaked, and it didn't budge. At the same time, he pulled the belt with stubborn delicacy, sliding the little boy's knee out of the stone cut, millimeter by millimeter, until he felt the resistance give way like a knot untying. The child held his breath, and so did he. There was a moment of suspension, a soundless void, and then the knee was free. The relief didn't bring rest, it brought urgency. His entire body by this point was trembling, his muscles begging for respite, his hands throbbing at the wrists, but his soul rose in place of the muscle, taking on the task with a calmness that seemed unbecoming of anyone. He arched his torso, offering his back as a shield, cradled the little one against his chest, adjusted the child's head under his chin to shield his face from the dust, and tested the exit route with his eyes and his skin. To the right, the shadow promised space. To the left, the iron promised pain. He chose the shadow. He dragged himself forward one hand at a time, elbows digging microscopic trenches, knees creaking like ancient hinges, and with each advance he heard, in an almost divine background, the chorus of the street that turned to silence when the building creaked and to prayer when the void opened. On the third advance, a searing pain shot through his lower back with the sharpness of lightning. His body wanted to stop. He pressed his forehead against the concrete and spoke to you as if speaking to an exhausted soldier. "One more." He moved. "One more." He moved again. Just one more. And so from one more to the next, he moved the child from the realm of ruin to the realm of return. One last obstacle stood as a final guardian. A low crossbar begged him to empty his lungs to fit. He faced the narrow passage, exhaled until his chest felt like nothing, drew back his shoulders, rotated his hips, and the child passed first, gliding, as if born. For a second, the soldier thought he would be trapped. The crossbar bit into his shirt. The rebar brushed against his makeshift helmet. The dust robbed him of the last of his breath. Then a hand appeared from the light, a red glove, firm, trained, and grasped the small fist he was pushing. Another hand, bare-skinned and trembling with faith, pressed against the outside like a blessing. He couldn't see the face, but he knew. The chain was formed. The whole world was reduced to completing this gesture. He pushed the child with one last thrust of everything he had, and when he felt the light weight greeted by life outside, his body collapsed inside, in a mixture of darkness and peace that felt like an end. But to his soul was a beginning. The first light the soldier saw after hours in the darkness wasn't that of the firefighters' flashlights, nor the metallic reflection on the twisted iron. It was the bright glow coming from the child's eyes, open for the first time since the collapse. Small, frightened, covered in dust and tears, but filled with that stubborn flame that only life knows how to keep alive when everyone already believes otherwise. He pulled her against his chest, embracing her with a strength that blended protection and despair, feeling her tiny body tremble and her heart beat irregularly, but steadily. It was life. Life where before there had been silence. For a moment, time froze. The building still creaked. The firefighters shouted orders. The crowd outside held their breath. But for him, only that small body pressed against his existed. The smell of dust, sweat, and blood, mixed with the faint perfume of a child, seemed stronger than any memory of war. He closed his eyes and silently thanked, not a specific god, but fate itself, which had finally allowed him to taste victory over death. Then began the difficult journey out. With the child cradled in his arms, the soldier advanced backward, allowing the firefighters to guide the narrow path with flashlights and brief commands. Every meter gained was a struggle against his body, which threatened to collapse from exhaustion. His breathing was a hoarse roar, blood trickled from the cuts, his vision blurred, but he never let go of the child. He used his own body as a shield, hunching his shoulders, raising his arm to protect his fragile head, dragging himself through gaps so narrow it seemed impossible to get out alive. Outside, the mother waited, unable to blink. The wheelless blue cart was still clutched to her chest, as if it were a charm, and her knees trembled so much that two women held her by the arms. With each second of silence, she closed her eyes and murmured the same phrase, "He's going to come out. He's going to come out." And when finally the glare of the lanterns revealed the shadow of the soldier emerging with a bundle in his arms, a scream rang out across the street like lightning. It wasn't just the mother. It was the entire street that raised its voice, as if they had all given birth to this miracle together. The firefighters stepped forward, extending their hands, but the soldier hesitated for a second. He pressed the child to his chest, as if to reassure himself that he was truly alive, not an illusion created by fatigue. He felt the small chest rise and fall against his collarbone, heard a hoarse sob escape his fragile throat, and only then did he relent. He handed the boy into the arms of the nearest paramedic, who quickly assessed his vital signs. The announcement came quickly, firmly, and filled with relief. "He's breathing!" The mother collapsed in tears. She fell to her knees on the asphalt, her hands outstretched in supplication, until someone helped her up and carried her to her son. When she finally held him in her arms, the scene became unbearable, even for the hardest of hearts. She kissed him, covered him with tears, repeated his name between sobs and nervous laughter, as if unsure whether to mourn what she had lost or what she had regained. The boy, still weak, raised his hand and showed the cart the firefighters had brought back. The simple gesture broke what remained of collective resistance. Men wept unabashedly, women hugged, neighbors joined in spontaneous applause. The soldier staggered back a few steps, his body begging for respite. His vision wavered, but he still couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. The mother, the son, the broken toy transformed into a symbol. This was the answer he'd been searching for years, the redemption no war had ever granted him. For an instant, the weight of the ghosts he carried seemed to dissolve into the dust blown away by the wind. But the crowd wouldn't let him disappear into silence. A chorus of applause began, timidly, then grew until it echoed throughout the street. He wasn't seeking recognition, but the gesture of those people wasn't a show of applause. It was collective gratitude, the silent acknowledgement that someone had carried them all on their back, diving where no one would dare tread. The soldier raised his hand, not as if thanking them, but as if asking for silence again, and his eyes, tired and red, sought only those of his mother. She, hugging her son, returned his gaze with a small gesture, a tear-filled wave as if to say, "You gave me my life back." And in that instant, the soldier knew the mission was complete. The chaos that had dominated the street gradually gave way to a strange stillness, as if time itself had stopped to witness the miracle. The child was safe, supported by paramedics, and the mother held her close to her chest as if refusing to let her go again, as if needing to feel the pulse of life to believe this wasn't a dream. Around her, neighbors, onlookers, and firefighters watched in reverent silence, some still in tears, others staring at the exhausted soldier who remained standing only by sheer stubbornness. He was covered in dust, his clothes in tatters, his hands bleeding from open wounds. But what was most striking wasn't the physical marks, it was his gaze. A gaze that for years had carried shadows of distant wars, memories that haunted him in the silent early mornings. Now, that same gaze seemed to have found peace. He wasn't smiling, but there was serenity in his expression, as if he had finally put the last piece of a puzzle that was consuming him inside into place. The mother tried to approach. She wanted to thank him, to tell him that he had saved not just a child but her own mother's soul, to tell him that she would never forget his face. But when she extended her hand, he took a step back, not out of indifference, but because he understood that the hero should not be remembered as a man, but as a gesture. The soldier knew he needed neither applause nor tribute. The true reward was already before him, a mother and son united once more. The firefighters tried to carry him to the ambulance, insisting he needed treatment. but he shook his head firmly. He pulled the small stroller wheel he'd found among the wreckage from his pocket and handed it to his mother. The woman held it in amazement, recognizing the symbol that tied the whole story together. She looked up, ready to thank him, but he was already turning away, walking slowly down the still dust-covered street. The crowd parted in silence. Some tried to call out to him, but their voices faded into the air. The soldier continued step after step, like a shadow fading at sunrise. No one knew his name. No one knew where he came from. To everyone, he would be remembered only as the man who entered the rubble. A simple title, but charged with the grandeur that only eternal gestures possess. The mother, still holding her son, looked up to look for him. But when she tried to find him among the dust and the crowd, there was no sign of him. He had disappeared as silently as he had appeared. It was at that moment that something inside her broke and reformed at the same time. She felt it wasn't just chance. She felt that the soldier hadn't appeared by coincidence, but by a greater order, as if the universe had decided to restore to her the life she was about to lose. Years would pass, and that child would grow up hearing the story of how he was rescued from death by the arms of an unknown man. He would forever treasure the blue cart without wheels, a symbol that life can begin again even when everything seems destroyed. And his mother, in her nightly prayers, would never fail to mention the soldier who appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly, as if he were a uniformed angel sent to repay a debt the world owed her. Fate, however, is wise in its silence. The soldier, disappearing into the streets, carried not only wounds or fatigue, he carried the certainty that finally he had found redemption. The guilt that had haunted him for years now became a legacy. He had not only saved a child, he had saved himself from a past that suffocated him. The karma that punished him with memories of abandonment now offered him the relief of having been the difference between life and death. And so, as the city slowly returned to life, as sirens receded and the dust began to settle, only the invisible mark of what had happened there remained. A ruined building, a broken stroller, a mother and son reunited, and the memory of a man who carried the weight of a personal war on his shoulders to transform the fate of a family. That day, everyone understood something without needing words. Heroes don't just sit around for applause. They come, do what needs to be done, and disappear. But they leave behind proof that the impossible can be overcome. And the mother, pressing her son to her breast, murmured through tears of gratitude, "He didn't just save us from death, he taught us to live again." That day, everyone understood without words. Heroes don't just sit around for applause. They come, do what needs to be done, and disappear, leaving behind the invisible mark of a gesture that never fades. The soldier departed without saying his name, but he left forever engraved the fate of a family and all who witnessed that miracle. A building in ruins, a broken cart, a mother and son reunited, and the memory of a man who, by facing his own ghosts, restored to the world the hope that many had already lost. As the mother wept with gratitude, clutching her son to her chest, everyone knew they had witnessed not just a rescue, but a silent life lesson. The impossible can be overcome when one chooses not to retreat. And in that moment, life took on new meaning. If this story touched your heart, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories like this one, and comment below. Heroes exist. Your participation helps spread messages of faith, hope, and humanity that the world so desperately needs.